The room was too quiet, too still, too heavy for anyone to breathe comfortably. And yet, in that silence, one question echoed louder than everything else. What do you say to the parent you haven't spoken to in years when they might be facing their last conscious moment? What do you say when all the chances you thought you had left suddenly collapse into a single, fragile moment that could disappear before you find the words? That was the reality Meghan Markle stepped into. But according to one doctor who claims he was present that day, the moment didn't unfold with the tenderness anyone expected. In fact, he says it unfolded in a way that stunned the medical staff, reshaped the narrative of a father-daughter relationship already stressed to its breaking point, and revealed a side of Meghan that the world had never seen so clearly or so starkly. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Before we go deeper, let me ask you something. If you had only seconds, just seconds, to speak to a dying parent, would you choose forgiveness, silence, anger, love? Or would you say something so unexpected that the doctor watching from the foot of the bed would later confess he couldn't understand how such words came from someone in that position? This is where the story begins, with a sentence, a breath, and a truth that shocked everyone lucky or unlucky enough to hear it. But we're not starting inside the hospital room. No, to understand how that moment even became possible, we need to start before Meghan walked through the door, before she took that first step down the hallway, before her eyes met the man lying on that bed. Because according to sources, she hesitated. Not just a small hesitation, not the kind of pause one takes when collecting their thoughts. This hesitation lasted long enough for multiple staff members to later confirm that something about Meghan's demeanor seemed conflicted, nervous, guarded, not grieving, guarded. Which brings us to the question, why? Why would a daughter who hadn't seen her father in years, and who hadn't spoken to him meaningfully in almost as long, appear nervous rather than emotional? What was she preparing for? What was she afraid might happen once she walked into that room? And the deeper question, did she go for him, or for herself? The doctor claims he noticed this from the first second. He wasn't a gossip, he wasn't a tabloid reader, and he didn't care about royal drama. He cared about the human dynamic that was unfolding like a delicate, dangerous surgical procedure. To him, the emotional distance between Meghan and her father was more fragile than any heartbeat monitor in that room. Let's rewind a little more, to the moment Meghan received the call. According to one insider, Meghan didn't answer right away. They said she let the phone ring longer than expected. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't know what awaited her on the other end. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet indecision before picking up a phone you know won't deliver good news. And when she did answer, she reportedly asked the same question twice. Is it serious? Is it serious? Not dramatic, not panicked, but controlled, almost rehearsed. And when she was told yes, something changed. Something the insider later described as a shift in her voice that suggested she was bracing for something she didn't want to confront. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever had a moment where the past you tried to bury suddenly demands your attention? Where every unresolved conflict, every unanswered message, every hurt, and every misunderstanding rises like steam around you? That's what this phone call represented. And that is what Meghan carried into the hospital with her. She didn't run. She didn't rush. She didn't break down. She prepared. But what she prepared for, that's where the story becomes complicated. Because according to the doctor, the same doctor who would later reveal the shocking sentence Meghan said at the bedside, Meghan brought something with her that hinted she wasn't sure she wanted this visit to be emotional, or intimate, or even private. In fact, the staff said she arrived with someone unexpected, someone whose presence confused the nurses, someone who shouldn't have been there in a moment described as potentially final. Their identity will matter later, and when I reveal it in a future chapter, the puzzle pieces will snap together with a clarity that may surprise you. But let's return to the hallway. The walk from the reception desk to Thomas Markle's room wasn't long. But if you ask the staff who watched Meghan walk it, they'll tell you it felt like she was walking much farther, not physically, but emotionally. Almost as if each step carried the weight of years of public arguments, interviews, accusations, heartbreak, misunderstandings, and silence. Have you ever tried walking towards someone you weren't sure wanted to see you? That's what the walk looked like. Meghan kept her head lowered. One nurse noted she seemed to steady herself right before turning the corner into the corridor that led to Thomas's room. She paused, exhaled, then continued forward. But the doctor watching noticed something more subtle. Her expression wasn't fear. It wasn't grief. It was something he later described as emotional bracing, a kind of internal armor. And here's where the contradictions begin. Contradictions that define the entire Markle family story. To the world, Meghan has at times described Thomas as manipulative, invasive, untrustworthy, even harmful to her emotional well-being. But to Thomas, Meghan wasn't a global actress, duchess, or public figure. She was his daughter, the girl he photographed on her way to school, the girl he once described proudly to coworkers, the girl he believed he'd see again one day, if fate allowed it. Now fate was giving them a moment neither had asked for, at a time neither was ready for. And here is where the story takes its next emotional turn. The doctor later claimed that before Meghan even entered the room, she made a private request that surprised the staff. Not something illegal, not something dramatic, but something that struck the doctor as unusual for a visit of this emotional magnitude. I won't reveal the request yet, not until a later chapter, but let me just say this. It created tension before she even crossed the threshold. And then she reached the door. Her hand hovered just inches from it, but she didn't push it open. Instead, she pressed her palm flat against the wood, not to feel it. More like she was silently asking the universe whether she should step into the past she'd tried so hard to escape. The staff members watching exchanged glances. One nurse whispered, "She's deciding." And she was. But then, after a breath that felt like it lasted a lifetime, Meghan pushed the door open, slowly, quietly, and the room changed. There he was. Thomas Markle. Not the man from the tabloids. Not the man from interviews. Not the father from photographs. Just a human being in a vulnerable moment. Alive, conscious, but weak. A man who looked smaller than his reputation. Softer than the stories. Sadder than the narrative. And Meghan froze. Just for a moment, but she froze. The doctor said he watched her eyes flicker, not with shock, but with something he described as a clash between longing and resentment. Imagine seeing your parent again after years. Would the first thing you feel be love, pain, anger, relief, or something in between? That flicker was everything. She stepped closer, then stopped at the foot of the bed. And Thomas opened his eyes. The doctor said he would never forget that expression. Not happiness, not relief, but a quiet, trembling recognition, like someone who had been waiting for a visit he wasn't sure would ever come. He spoke. His voice was faint. But Meghan's reaction was not what anyone expected. Instead of rushing to him, instead of holding his hand, instead of whispering comfort, she said something the doctor described as emotionally distant, almost formal. Not cruel, but not soft either. He wrote it down later. It became part of his notes. It became part of this story. But that wasn't the shock. That wasn't the moment that made the doctor step back. That wasn't the sentence that will become the center of this entire expose. No. That moment came later. It came after the small talk, after the silence, after the tension settled into the room like a ghost watching them. After Meghan looked at her father and said something that made the doctor's jaw tighten, made the nurse beside him inhale sharply, and made Thomas close his eyes, not because he was tired, but because he understood the deeper meaning of what she said. This sentence, this single line, would redefine everything. It would reveal more about their relationship than every interview combined. It would expose fears, regrets, and truths neither of them had ever admitted. And the doctor later said he believed it was the moment that broke Thomas's heart more deeply than his medical condition ever could. Are you ready? Because what Meghan said next was something no one in that room expected. And the impact of those words is still echoing today. The phone rang, piercing the quiet of a Los Angeles morning. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3. Meghan Markle sat at her kitchen table, untouched coffee cooling beside her, staring at the screen as though willing it not to show the name she feared. Her hand hovered over the phone. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she exhaled slowly, a deliberate pause that carried the weight of years. Have you ever hesitated like that? When you know that one call could change everything, that every word on the other end might close a door forever? Meghan did. And in that hesitation, The entire world of her relationship with her father seemed to pause with her. When she finally picked up, the voice on the other end wasn't Thomas's. It was an intermediary, a nurse, a family friend, someone who had been entrusted with delivering the news no one wanted to hear. "It's serious," they said, just like that, for words that landed like a brick in the center of her chest. Meghan's reaction was not the dramatic collapse people might expect from someone in the public eye. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She asked the question twice, almost mechanically. "Is it serious? Is it serious?" The repetition hinted at disbelief, at fear, at a mind not quite ready to process what was coming. She wasn't acting. She was bracing herself, because this wasn't just about a medical update. This was about decades of estrangement, hurt, misunderstandings, and fractured trust. This call carried the weight of every interview, every headline, every accusation, every private argument that had ever existed between daughter and father. And suddenly, it demanded an answer. Would she go? Could she go? And what would happen when she finally stepped into the hospital room? Meghan reportedly paused for a long time after the call, long enough for observers later to note that her hesitation was unusually extended. Too long for someone who simply wanted to attend a hospital visit. She seemed to be grappling with more than logistics. She was grappling with the very notion of facing a man she hadn't spoken to in years, a man she had publicly criticized and distanced herself from. Could she find the right words, or any words at all? Her decision was made slowly, deliberately. She would go, but she would not go unprepared. Insiders say she arranged transportation quietly, avoiding media attention, as though aware that her arrival would be scrutinized by cameras, reporters, and social media alike. Yet, the trip to the hospital was more than a physical journey. It was an emotional gauntlet, a trek through memories she had buried deep. Family holidays, birthday presents, arguments, and missed milestones. Each mile closer to Thomas Markle's bedside brought with it a cocktail of anticipation and dread. When Meghan finally arrived at the hospital, she did not enter with a rush of emotion. Staff reported seeing her linger for a moment in the lobby, taking a deep breath, straightening her posture. There was no visible tears, no open displays of grief. Instead, her expression was controlled, guarded, determined. Observers later described it as emotional bracing, as if she were preparing to shield herself from the impact of what was to come. Then came the hallway. The short walk to Thomas Markle's room that somehow felt like a corridor of judgment and reflection. Every step Meghan took carried the weight of years of absence, rumors, media scrutiny, and family pain. Staff whispered among themselves. One nurse noted, "She seemed to steady herself at the corner, like she was preparing to face a storm." And yet, despite all the careful preparation, Meghan was not alone. According to hospital insiders, she arrived with an unexpected companion. Someone who was not a family member, not a legal representative, not a nurse, someone whose presence in that intimate and sensitive moment raised eyebrows and tension among the staff. Details of who this person was and why they were there will become critical as this story unfolds. But for now, it was enough to know that the dynamics of the visit were already complicated before she entered the room. Inside Thomas Markle's hospital room, the atmosphere was quiet but heavy, thick with the scent of antiseptic and the unspoken reality of mortality. The man lying there was smaller than the public image suggested. Frail, vulnerable, human. Not a figure in tabloid photos, but a man confronting the twilight of life with trembling hands and eyes that reflected both love and disappointment. Meghan paused just outside the room. Her hand hovered over the door handle. She took a breath, a beat, and then another. What she did next was simple physically, but monumental emotionally. She stepped inside. The doctor present, who would later become a key witness in revealing what was said that day, observed every detail. He noted the flicker in Meghan's eyes, a mixture of longing, resentment, and uncertainty. It wasn't fear. It wasn't joy. It was a clash of emotions that had built over years of estrangement. And in that moment, the doctor realized he was witnessing not just a visit, but a psychological negotiation, an attempt by Meghan to reconcile the past with the present, under the most intense conditions imaginable. Thomas Markle, upon opening his eyes, registered recognition immediately. Not happiness, not relief, but a fragile acknowledgement that someone he had longed to see had arrived. His voice was faint, trembling. "Meghan." And here is where the first subtle shock of the visit occurred. Meghan did not respond with tears or embrace. She did not reach instinctively for his hand. Instead, she spoke a line that was described by the doctor as emotionally distant, measured, almost formal. The staff noticed it. Thomas noticed it. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to freeze. But that was just the beginning. Because this visit was never intended to follow the scripts we imagine for reconciliations. The doctor later admitted he had never seen such a complex interplay of emotions in a hospital setting. There was grief, yes. There was tension, but there was also calculation. Something unspoken but palpable. An emotional armor that Meghan had carried with her for the entire visit. As the minutes passed, Meghan engaged in brief, almost perfunctory small talk. She inquired about his comfort, about the treatments he was undergoing, about the practicalities of the hospital stay. Each question seemed carefully constructed, not to offend, but also not to reveal vulnerability. And Thomas, understanding her distance, responded with the measured kindness of a father who had waited years for this moment, but wasn't entirely sure it would bring the reconciliation he hoped for. The tension mounted as the doctor observed the subtle body language, the micro-expressions, the silent negotiations between parent and child. Nurses noted that the air in the room was heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. And then it happened, the moment that would define the visit, the line that would later shock the doctor and become central to this story. Meghan spoke words that, according to the doctor, no one expected from someone in her position. Words that were not cruel, but neither were they comforting. They were honest in a way that cut through the superficial expectations of public perception. They revealed hesitation, emotional conflict, and a guarded heart. They hinted at truths that had been buried beneath years of estrangement and media narratives. Thomas reacted subtly. A shift of the eyes, a small intake of breath, a tightening of the jaw. Nothing overt, but enough for the doctor to note that the emotional impact was immediate. It was a moment suspended in time, a collision of past grievances and present realities. And yet, the doctor noted, this was not the most shocking part. The most shocking part, he later revealed, came moments later when Meghan elaborated on her words. It was then that the full emotional weight hit the room. It was then that the layers of estrangement, fear, pride, and regret became undeniably clear. And it was then that the staff realized this was not just a visit. It was a pivotal, unforgettable encounter that would shape how history viewed this father-daughter relationship. Have you ever witnessed a conversation where every word carries years of history? Every phrase a burden? Where silence speaks as loudly as speech? That's what happened in that hospital room. And the doctor, the quiet observer in the corner, was struck with a realization. Whatever happened in these next few minutes would define not just their relationship, but the narrative that the public had consumed for years. And then came the cliffhanger. Because Meghan said something no one in the room expected. Something that would later be recorded, recounted, and analyzed by the doctor. A sentence that would illuminate motives, fears, and truths, all at once. The hospital corridor was quiet, but not serene. It was the kind of quiet that hums with expectation, the kind that tells staff something unusual is about to happen. And on this particular morning, the tension was almost tangible. Word had circulated that Meghan Markle was arriving to visit her father, Thomas Markle, who lay weakened and frail in a hospital bed just down the hall. Staff whispered, not in gossip, but in anticipatory unease. Meghan Markle, the Duchess, the actress, the public figure whose every move was tracked and dissected. And yet here she was, stepping into a world entirely different from the glare of media attention. A hospital wing dominated by the smell of antiseptic, the quiet beeping of monitors, and the vulnerability of a man lying on the edge between life and death. The first staff member to notice her arrival was a nurse at the reception desk. She recalled, later in an interview, that Meghan's presence wasn't dramatic, as one might imagine from television portrayals. No entourage swarmed her. No cameras flashed. She didn't stride in with confidence. She was measured, almost cautious, almost hesitant. And that hesitation set the tone for what would happen next. Have you ever seen someone enter a room and immediately change the energy without a word? That was Meghan. Staff described it as a subtle shift. The air thickened. The usual rhythm of the wing faltered. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She walked deliberately, each step controlled, her eyes scanning the hallway just enough to register the presence of nurses and aides without truly seeing them. What struck the staff most, however, wasn't her demeanor. It was the unexpected companion she brought with her. A person whose identity was initially unclear. Not a family member. Not a medical professional. Someone who, as they later learned, would play a role in the dynamics of this visit in ways no one anticipated. The staff's curiosity was piqued, but protocol demanded they maintain discretion. The nurses exchanged glances, subtle but significant. One whispered to another, "Who's that with her? That shouldn't be allowed in the room, should it?" The other shook her head, equally puzzled. And yet, no one stopped them. No one dared. Meghan Markle, after all, was not just a visitor. She was a public figure whose presence alone carried implications that extended far beyond hospital policy. As Meghan approached the room, her steps slowed. Observers later noted that she paused just outside the door, taking a long breath. There was no urgency in her movement, no visible panic, just a measured, almost ritualistic pause, as if she were preparing herself for an emotional gauntlet she knew lay on the other side of that door. The doctor who was present that day observed everything from the doorway. He was accustomed to human behavior under stress. He had seen grief, denial, anger, and confusion countless times. But something about this was different. Meghan's hesitation wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It wasn't nervousness stemming from concern for her father's health. It was a complex combination: self-preservation, emotional calculation, and perhaps a lingering wariness from years of public scrutiny. He later described her expression as a tightrope walk between vulnerability and armor. In other words, Meghan Markle arrived prepared for confrontation, not with others, but with her own emotions. And the doctor sensed immediately that the dynamic in the room was about to be far more complicated than anyone anticipated. The staff noted another detail: her gaze. Meghan didn't look directly at Thomas immediately. She scanned the room, briefly noting the equipment, the bed positioning, the monitors, and the staff. She acknowledged them with slight nods, polite but distant, signaling awareness without intimacy. Her attention was not on the staff, it was on the man in the bed. Yet even there, her eyes did not lock immediately. There was hesitation, a flicker of doubt that seemed to ask herself whether she could bear the next moments. The nurse at the foot of the bed recalled that Meghan finally approached, her movements slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. She paused at the bedside, her hand hovering for just a second over the railing. A fleeting moment, unnoticed by most, but the doctor saw it. He interpreted it as Meghan subconsciously measuring the emotional distance between herself and her father, an invisible barrier she hadn't yet crossed. Have you ever approached someone you love but fear? Someone whose judgment, approval, or disappointment you've carried silently for years. Every second feels like a test. Every small gesture is weighted with consequence. That's what the staff witnessed. Meghan Markle navigating an emotional minefield with care, caution, and a strategy that was unmistakably deliberate. And then came her first words, though not to Thomas. She addressed the room. A quiet, almost imperceptible greeting, polite, measured, professional. It wasn't a "hello, Dad" moment. Not yet. The staff later said it felt rehearsed, a verbal buffer that allowed her to maintain composure before stepping fully into the emotionally charged encounter. Thomas's condition complicated matters further. He was alert, yes, but fragile. His movement slow, his breathing uneven. The doctor noted subtle shifts in his vitals as Meghan entered the room, not because of her presence alone, but because her arrival introduced an emotional variable he couldn't control. The doctor later admitted that he had never witnessed a patient's heart rate respond to emotion so visibly before. As Meghan moved closer, her companion remained near the doorway. Observers later said the presence of this individual seemed to add both a protective and controlling dynamic. Staff reported that the companion occasionally scanned the room, sometimes appearing tense, sometimes calm, as if measuring the interaction between daughter and father. No one spoke, yet their influence was palpable. The tension was punctuated by silence. Not empty silence, but charged silence. the kind that carries both expectation and dread. Nurses described it as almost unbearable, the kind of silence that magnifies every heartbeat, every breath, every subtle movement. And then, after a moment that seemed to stretch impossibly long, Meghan finally focused on her father. Her eyes met his, and in that instant, the doctor later recalled, everything changed. The room seemed smaller, heavier, more intimate. Thomas's eyes widened slightly, not with shock, but with recognition. That faint, tremulous acknowledgement that the person he had waited to see had arrived, and that this visit might be both a blessing and a challenge. The first interaction between Meghan and Thomas was cautious, tentative. Meghan did not rush. She did not reach impulsively. She measured every word, every gesture, every facial expression. And the staff, who had been observing quietly from the doorway, noted that this was unusual. Most visitors approached a hospitalized loved one with instinct, with raw emotion, with vulnerability. Meghan approached with precision. The doctor described it as a negotiation conducted in silence and subtle gestures. The staff agreed. The room was no longer a hospital room. It had transformed into a stage for an emotional reckoning that had been decades in the making. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, Meghan spoke. Her words were deliberate, measured, neutral, almost formal. Not cruel, not harsh, but not comforting either. Enough to startle Thomas, enough to make the staff lean in, enough to make the doctor take note that the dynamics of this visit were unlike any he had ever witnessed. It was the first sign that this was not going to be a typical reconciliation. It was the first hint that Meghan's presence carried more than concern for her father's health. It carried unresolved issues, emotional boundaries, and truths that had yet to be spoken. And that's when the first cliffhanger arrived, because as staff would later report, there was a subtle shift after her words. A pause, a small intake of breath, a glance exchanged between Meghan and her companion. And the doctor knew then that the most revealing moment of this visit, the sentence that would define it, the words that would shock and haunt, had not yet been spoken. But it was coming. And when it did, it would change everything the staff thought they understood about Meghan Markle, Thomas Markle, and the fractured bond between father and daughter. The moment Meghan Markle entered the hospital room, all eyes were on Thomas. But the doctor, stationed quietly at the foot of the bed, saw more than just a frail man lying in a hospital gown. He saw a lifetime compressed into the fragile shell of a body. Decades of parenting, pride, regrets, and disappointments, all visible in subtle gestures, in trembling hands, in eyes that had witnessed too much and yet held hope for a daughter who had grown distant. Thomas Markle's condition was delicate, but not terminal, at least not in the immediate sense. He was being treated for a severe illness, one that weakened his body and drained his energy. Yet what concerned the medical staff, and would later concern the doctor most, was not just the physical fragility, but the emotional vulnerability. Thomas's heart was strained, not just from his medical state, but from the emotional anticipation of seeing his daughter after years of estrangement. The doctor had prepared himself for countless hospital interactions, but he had never encountered a scenario like this. Patients often display fear, anger, or resignation in the face of illness. But here, Thomas's eyes betrayed a complex layering of emotions. Longing, hope, and a subtle apprehension. His body leaned slightly forward, almost imperceptibly, as if trying to bridge a distance he feared could never be closed. Have you ever observed someone who is physically present but emotionally suspended in a delicate balance? That was Thomas. Every micro-expression, every subtle movement was amplified by the intensity of the moment. Even his breath, steady, yet punctuated by shallow inhalations, spoke volumes. The doctor noted these details meticulously, aware that in situations like this, observation often reveals more than conversation. The room itself seemed to shrink as Meghan approached. The space between father and daughter, once filled with familial history, was now punctuated by years of silence, misunderstandings, and media-fueled narratives. And as she drew closer, the doctor realized that every gesture, every measured step, every blink carried an emotional weight no machine could measure. Thomas's condition complicated the dynamic. His heart rate was stable, but subtle signs indicated heightened stress. tiny twitches in his fingers, a brief furrow of the brow, a quick exhale through the nose. The doctor, trained to detect such signals, understood that these were not merely reactions to illness. They were emotional responses. Responses to the anticipation, tension, and unspoken questions hovering in the room. The doctor later described Thomas's expression as a mix of hope and trepidation. Hope that his daughter had come with reconciliation in mind. Trepidation that her presence might reopen wounds too long buried. And the juxtaposition was heartbreaking. For years, Thomas had lived with public scrutiny and private hurt. Now, faced with the possibility of closure, he was at the mercy of a conversation that had been decades in the making. Meghan's presence introduced a new variable. Emotional ambiguity. Unlike typical visitors who bring comfort or confrontation, Meghan brought a mix of both. She radiated care, yet maintained distance. She offered proximity, yet seemed to measure every word. The doctor observed that this duality created a tension in the room that exacerbated Thomas's fragile state. And then there was the companion. Positioned near the doorway, quietly observing, occasionally shifting weight or glancing at the staff, their presence added another layer of complexity. The staff later admitted that they weren't sure how to interpret this silent figure. Were they there for protection, guidance, oversight, or perhaps influence? The answer remained unclear, but it contributed to the charged atmosphere. The doctor noted one particularly subtle but telling interaction. As Meghan reached the bedside, Thomas instinctively moved his hand, a small gesture seeking connection. Meghan hesitated, her hand hovering above his. She did not immediately touch him. The doctor later described this moment as the physical embodiment of the emotional distance that had defined their relationship for so long. It was a pause that spoke louder than words. In that suspended second, the staff could almost feel the weight of unspoken questions. Would she reconcile? Would she forgive? Would she express regret, or maintain the guarded composure that had become her signature? Thomas attempted a faint smile. Not wide, not expressive, but enough to convey recognition and longing. The doctor watched carefully, noting that even this subtle gesture caused a small shift in his vitals, a barely perceptible increase in heart rate, a quickening of the pulse. Emotional stimuli, he realized, were as significant as any medical intervention in this moment. Have you ever felt the emotional pressure of a room so intensely that it affects your physical state? That was what Thomas experienced, and it was mirrored in the doctor's observation notes. Small, precise, almost clinical, yet infused with the awareness that what he was witnessing transcended typical hospital interactions. As Meghan finally spoke, her words were measured, deliberate, and careful. They did not carry the weight of warmth one might expect. Instead, they were neutral, bordering on formal. The doctor recorded the details meticulously: tone, cadence, choice of words, subtle inflections. Every element suggested a calculated emotional strategy. Thomas's reaction was immediate but controlled. His eyes shifted slightly, brows raised subtly, lips parting in a micro-expression of surprise or recognition. The doctor interpreted this as an emotional response layered with decades of history. He later wrote in his notes that the father's mind processed not just the words, but the implications, the intent, and the emotional subtext behind them. And yet, as precise as Meghan's words were, they were only the opening act. The doctor sensed, almost immediately, that the deeper, more revealing moment had not yet arrived. The tension in the room was deliberate, a carefully maintained balance between approach and retreat, between engagement and distance. Staff members noted another subtle but significant observation. Meghan did not sit, did not lean in, did not lower herself to her father's level. She remained upright, composed, yet clearly attentive. Her eyes, though focused on Thomas, flickered occasionally toward her companion. The doctor noted that these glances were not casual. They were checks, confirmations, almost silent communications, suggesting that Meghan's emotional approach was being carefully monitored and guided. The doctor's most striking observation came after a brief exchange. Meghan asked a question about Thomas's comfort, not his illness, not his treatment, but his immediate comfort in the room. It was a mundane inquiry, yet delivered in a way that was emotionally calculated. The doctor wrote in his notes that her words were courteous, almost perfunctory, but contained a deliberate emotional distance that maintained control over the interaction. Thomas responded with measured politeness, acknowledging her question without delving into emotional depth. And in that exchange, the doctor saw a pattern emerge. Meghan was controlling the pace and tone of the visit, maintaining distance while offering enough proximity to avoid overt conflict. It was an emotional choreography that required both participants to navigate with care. And then came the moment that would define the visit. According to the doctor, Meghan's next words carried an emotional weight that eclipsed the neutral tone of the opening exchange. They revealed hesitation, guardedness, and an internal struggle that was palpable. The staff, though not fully understanding the implications, felt the shift in the atmosphere. Thomas's eyes flickered. His breathing shifted. Even his subtle finger movements betrayed heightened emotional sensitivity. Have you ever witnessed someone standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to step forward or retreat? That was the dynamic in the room. The doctor later said he recognized the moment instantly. This was the pivot point, the sentence that would reveal the depth of estrangement, the guarded walls of a daughter, and the vulnerability of a father who had waited too long for closure. And as the tension built, the doctor made a quiet, personal note: what Meghan was about to say, or perhaps what she was choosing not to say, would redefine the emotional reality of that hospital visit. Because even in her silence, her guarded approach, and her controlled demeanor, the doctor could sense an impending emotional reckoning. A moment that would shock the staff. A moment that would make Thomas pause, inhale sharply, and confront not just his own mortality, but the fragile truth of their relationship. The hospital's sliding doors opened, and Meghan Markle stepped through, quiet, composed, yet undeniably present. Unlike the dramatic entrances we imagine for someone of her status, there were no cameras, no flashes, no waiting crowds. There was only the sterile smell of antiseptic, the faint hum of machines, and the charged silence of a hospital wing anticipating something unusual. For the staff, it was immediately clear that this was not just another visitor. There was a subtle energy in the air, something heavier than usual. Meghan's walk was deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial. Each step seemed to carry the weight of years of estrangement, criticism, and fractured family history. Staff later described her demeanor as emotionally armored, yet strikingly present. Have you ever observed someone who appears physically calm, but whose every gesture is saturated with unspoken emotion? That was Meghan. Her posture was straight, controlled, almost regal in its precision. Yet her eyes flickered at the corners, betraying an internal struggle, a conflict between affection, apprehension, and the lingering burden of public scrutiny. She paused briefly in the hallway before approaching her father's room. It was a pause no one noticed in real time, but that would later be analyzed as a crucial moment. In that fleeting hesitation, Meghan seemed to mentally prepare for what she knew would be the most emotionally charged encounter of her life. Staff who later recounted the event said it was almost as if she were bracing herself for impact. Her companion, positioned discreetly near the doorway, moved subtly to give her space, maintaining an almost protective presence without intruding. The staff later admitted that this individual's presence added a layer of tension. They weren't sure if the companion was there for guidance, oversight, or influence. Whatever the purpose, it was clear that Meghan's arrival was not spontaneous. It was carefully orchestrated, down to the smallest gestures. When Meghan finally reached the door, she paused, hand hovering just inches from the handle. Her gaze swept over the room briefly, registering the hospital bed, the monitors, the medical equipment, and, most importantly, her father. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of concentration, contemplation, and internal conflict. The doctor observing noted this in detail. He later described it as the quiet moment before a storm. The subtle tension before two emotionally fractured individuals confront the reality of each other's presence. Thomas Markle, frail yet alert, lay waiting. His eyes opened slowly as Meghan stepped closer. There was recognition, but not joy. More a quiet acknowledgement that the anticipated moment had arrived. Staff members recalled that Meghan did not immediately approach her father. Instead, she lingered, adjusting her posture, perhaps negotiating with her own emotions before taking the next step. Nurses whispered to each other, noting that this was unusual. Most visitors, even those hesitant, would close the distance quickly. Meghan's approach was deliberate, almost ritualistic. And then came the first visible expression. Her eyes flickered, a micro-expression that the doctor later interpreted as a clash between longing and resentment. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to an untrained observer, yet it carried the weight of years of estrangement. It was the first hint that this encounter would not follow any expected script of reconciliation. Meghan's hand hovered over the bed railing for a brief moment. She did not immediately touch her father, nor did she sit. She remained upright, controlled, scanning him, measuring him, perhaps testing the emotional waters before fully engaging. Her companion subtly shifted, a silent communication between them that suggested Meghan's demeanor was being carefully monitored. Have you ever seen someone navigate a conversation not with words, but with gestures, posture, and subtle glances? That was the essence of Meghan's approach. Every movement was calculated, yet filled with emotional resonance. The staff sensed the tension immediately. This was not a casual visit. It was an emotional gauntlet. Thomas's initial reaction was a mixture of relief and apprehension. His eyes, though tired, reflected recognition. He attempted a faint smile, the kind that comes from both hope and uncertainty. The doctor noted the subtle changes in his vitals, a slight increase in heart rate, a shallow inhale, a minute flicker of tension in his hands. Emotional stimuli, he realized, were affecting him as much as any medical intervention could. The first words exchanged were neutral, cautious. Meghan asked about his comfort, the treatment, the room itself. The tone was measured, controlled, almost perfunctory. It was enough to acknowledge presence without revealing vulnerability. Staff noted that this choice of communication was unusual. Most daughters in her position might have leaned in, touched a hand, or offered visible affection. Meghan's approach was calculated, maintaining emotional distance while navigating a fragile situation. And yet, despite the measured tone, there were moments of vulnerability. Meghan's eyes betrayed brief flashes of emotion. Hesitation, concern, and perhaps the faintest trace of sorrow. The staff noticed these micro-moments, small enough to miss, but significant enough to indicate an internal struggle. The doctor observed them as well, recording every detail with meticulous care. The presence of her companion continued to add complexity. Standing near the doorway, silent but attentive, they occasionally exchanged glances with Meghan. Staff later said that these interactions were subtle yet impactful, almost as if the companion's presence influenced the rhythm of the visit. The doctor noted that Meghan's measured behavior seemed, in part, to accommodate or respond to this silent oversight. Have you ever been in a room where silence speaks louder than words? That was the dynamic here. Every gesture, every blink, every measured step carried weight. The doctor later described the atmosphere as a delicate balance of anticipation and tension, a space where both parties navigated emotional landmines without overt confrontation. Meghan's demeanor was striking in its control. She did not rush. She did not lean in. She maintained a careful distance, yet remained fully engaged. Her eyes, focused on her father, flickered briefly to monitors, equipment, and staff, registering the environment without distraction. Every movement was deliberate, as if rehearsed, yet suffused with emotional resonance. Thomas responded in kind, cautiously, yet with subtle vulnerability. His small gestures, adjusting a blanket, a slight tilt of the head, a micro-expression, revealed both hope and apprehension. The doctor noted that these subtle signals indicated a deep awareness of Meghan's guarded approach. He interpreted them as signs of a man who understood the delicate balance between connection and distance, love and disappointment. And then, as the tension mounted, Meghan's first significant verbal interaction occurred. Her words, though neutral, were carefully constructed. They acknowledged presence, expressed polite concern, and maintained emotional distance. Thomas responded with equal care, neither retreating nor overextending. The doctor later observed that this exchange was a prelude to the pivotal moment of the visit, a sentence that would ultimately define the encounter. Staff reported subtle reactions in Thomas, a slight shift in posture, a faint tightening of the jaw, and a micro-expression of surprise, or realization. These were minute details, almost invisible, yet indicative of the emotional gravity of the interaction. The doctor recorded these observations meticulously, understanding that the most significant moment had not yet arrived, but that the stage had been set. And as the room settled into this delicate equilibrium, everyone present, staff, doctor, companion, and patient, could feel it. The unspoken tension, the carefully maintained distance, the controlled gestures, all suggested that the next words Meghan would speak were about to carry extraordinary weight. Because in that room, on that day, Meghan Markle was not simply visiting her father. She was navigating decades of unresolved conflict, emotional expectation, and public scrutiny. Every action, every glance, every subtle gesture contributed to an atmosphere of suspense, a sense that something profoundly revealing was imminent. And then came the cliffhanger, an almost imperceptible pause, a deep inhale, a fleeting glance exchanged between Meghan and her companion. Staff leaned in slightly, the doctor sharpened his focus, and Thomas's eyes widened ever so slightly. The pivotal sentence, the one that would shock, hurt, and illuminate the complexities of this fractured relationship, was about to be spoken. The room was silent, yet heavy with anticipation. Meghan Markle stood near the hospital bed, her posture poised but tense. Thomas Markle, lying frail under the crisp white sheets, turned his gaze toward her. His eyes carried decades of longing, regret, and hope, the kind of emotions that cannot be erased by time or distance. Every breath he took seemed to weigh heavier under the gravity of this encounter. Have you ever been in a room where silence itself feels like a question? A silence that presses against your chest, demanding answers you might not be ready to give? That was the atmosphere at that exact moment. Staff who had worked in the hospital for decades admitted later that they had never experienced a quiet so charged, so electric. And then came the first words. Meghan spoke, not as a daughter pleading for reconciliation, nor as a public figure seeking sympathy. Her tone was calm, measured, almost formal, but every syllable carried emotional weight. According to the doctor who observed the visit, Meghan's opening line was careful, deliberate, designed to establish a controlled emotional space. It was not cold, but it was not warm. It was a statement that balanced affection with distance, acknowledgement with caution. She was navigating an intricate emotional minefield, and her words reflected years of contemplation, preparation, and hesitation. Thomas reacted immediately, his brow furrowed slightly, a subtle indication of surprise. Not shock at the words themselves, but at their unexpected nature. In all the interviews, public statements, and imagined confrontations, he had not anticipated this particular tone, this particular choice of words. The doctor observed that Thomas's vitals responded instantly, a slight uptick in heart rate, a quickened breathing pattern, the tiniest tremor in his hand. These physiological reactions were not due to illness alone. They were emotional responses to the delicate balance of confrontation and compassion that Meghan's words created. Meghan's words were carefully measured, but they hinted at something deeper, something unresolved. The doctor later noted that her phrasing suggested awareness of the past, acknowledgement of public scrutiny, and recognition of personal boundaries. It was as if she were simultaneously opening a door and setting a boundary at the same time. Staff in the room noticed a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal an internal struggle. Meghan was managing a complex array of emotions: love for her father, guilt for the distance between them, fear of public perception, and the desire to protect herself. Every microexpression, every subtle shift in posture, revealed layers of emotional nuance. Thomas's response was restrained but telling. He shifted slightly in bed, a small gesture that indicated recognition of both the care and the distance in Meghan's words. He attempted to smile, faint and fragile, but the effort was palpable. The doctor observed that Thomas's body language communicated longing and caution, a mixture of hope that this visit could bridge the gap and apprehension that it might reopen old wounds. Have you ever watched two people communicate more through silence than words? That's what unfolded next. Between the first sentence and the next, a weighty pause settled in the room. Meghan's eyes flickered toward her companion. as if seeking validation or reassurance. Thomas's gaze remained fixed on her, searching for signs of intent and emotion. The doctor described this moment as a delicate dance of anticipation and vulnerability. The staff, though trained to focus on medical details, could not ignore the tension. Nurses leaned in slightly, unconsciously drawn into the emotional gravity of the scene. The companion remained vigilant near the doorway, silent but attentive, as if ensuring that the interaction proceeded within the boundaries Meghan had established. Then came the second exchange. Meghan, maintaining her poised demeanor, elaborated carefully, choosing words that walked the line between honesty and emotional self-protection. She acknowledged her father's condition, expressed measured concern, yet inserted a subtle hint of emotional hesitation. The doctor noted that this was the point where the balance between intimacy and distance became palpable. Thomas's reaction was immediate and visceral. His fingers twitched slightly. His eyes widened for a moment, reflecting a surge of emotion, gratitude, longing, and confusion all at once. The doctor observed that Thomas processed not just the content of her words, but the emotional subtext, the careful layering of tone, intent, and restraint. Meghan's companion shifted slightly, a barely perceptible gesture that seemed to guide the emotional pacing of the encounter. Staff later remarked that this presence seemed to affect both Meghan and Thomas, subtly influencing body language and tone without a single word being exchanged. The first words exchanged between Meghan and Thomas revealed much more than a casual greeting. They were a microcosm of their entire relationship, controlled, conflicted, and profoundly human. The doctor emphasized that he had never witnessed such an interplay of restraint and vulnerability, even in high-profile families with complex dynamics. And then, in a moment that would later be recounted as pivotal, Meghan's words took a sharper emotional turn. She expressed something that the doctor described as honest, guarded, and chillingly candid. It was a line that, while not cruel, carried the weight of emotional finality. Staff sensed the shift immediately. The atmosphere thickened, hearts raced, and the subtle tension became almost palpable. Thomas's eyes reflected immediate recognition of the gravity in her tone. His breath hitched slightly. A small, involuntary shiver ran through him. It was as if the emotional dam that had been holding years of estrangement and longing in check was starting to crack. Have you ever heard a sentence that, while not loud or dramatic, hits like a thunderclap? That was the impact of Meghan's guarded admission. The doctor noted that in that precise moment, the dynamics of the room shifted entirely. This was no longer a neutral visit. It had become a defining emotional confrontation, a pivot point that would determine the trajectory of their interaction. Staff whispered later that even minor hospital noises, the beep of a monitor, the rustle of sheets, the distant footsteps in the corridor, felt amplified in that moment, punctuating the tension and emphasizing the emotional weight of the first words exchanged. Every second stretched longer than usual, every gesture more pronounced, every glance loaded with meaning. And then came the cliffhanger, because Meghan had yet to say the words that would shock not just her father, but everyone observing the visit. The first sentences set the stage, revealed intent, and hinted at emotion. But the revelation that would define the encounter was only moments away. The room seemed to shrink the moment Meghan spoke. The words were quiet, controlled, almost conversational, but the impact was seismic. "I can't promise I'll visit again," she said. Not in anger, not in malice, but with a detachment so measured it stunned everyone present. The doctor, observing from the doorway, immediately recognized the weight of this statement. It was not just a refusal. It was a declaration, an emotional boundary drawn in the most definitive way. Every nurse in the room felt the tension spike, an almost physical pressure that pressed against the chest and quickened the pulse. Thomas's reaction was immediate, though subtle, eyes widening, a small intake of breath, fingers gripping the sheets just slightly tighter. Have you ever heard words so unexpected that your mind races, trying to interpret intent, tone, and the future implications all at once? That was Thomas. His body, already weakened, registered the emotional jolt. And yet, he did not immediately speak. He simply stared, attempting to process not just the meaning of the sentence, but the layers beneath it. The years of distance, the public scrutiny, the fractured relationship, and now, this startling refusal, even if it was the last opportunity to connect. The doctor later recalled that Thomas's reaction was a complex mix of disbelief, hurt, and lingering hope. I could see him calculating what this meant for their relationship, the doctor said. Was it final? Was it negotiable? Was it simply a protective measure? His mind was racing, and his body responded accordingly. Meghan's eyes, though calm, revealed the faintest traces of inner turmoil. She was composed, yet there was a subtle flicker in her gaze, a micro-expression that hinted at conflict. Staff described it as an almost imperceptible hesitation, like a pause between emotion and duty. She was not cruel. She was cautious, balancing self-preservation with obligation. The emotional tightrope she walked was visible to all who observed her. The companion standing near the doorway shifted slightly, as if to support, guide, or perhaps monitor. No words were exchanged, yet the subtle movements communicated volumes. The staff later admitted that the presence of this companion added an almost surreal layer to the encounter, creating a triangle of observation, tension, and unspoken communication. Thomas attempted to respond, but words failed him. His mouth opened, then closed. His gaze sought an anchor, a clue to the reasoning behind this declaration. The doctor noted that his body betrayed the internal struggle, a shallow intake of breath, a slight tremor in his hand, a tiny twitch in his leg. These subtle signs spoke louder than any words he could muster. Have you ever faced a moment when someone you expected to comfort you instead sets a boundary that feels like rejection? That was Thomas. The statement wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatic, but it reverberated with the emotional force of a tidal wave. It forced him to confront the possibility that reconciliation might not happen, that time might be running out, and that the gap between them could remain unbridged. The staff watched in stunned silence. Nurses later admitted that they had never experienced such a poignant, charged moment in years of hospital work. It was not the first time they had witnessed emotional interactions between family members, but it was the first time they had seen such a public figure navigate such intense personal conflict with such calculated restraint. The doctor reflected on Meghan's choice of words. She could have approached with warmth, with gestures of reconciliation. She could have offered comfort, hope, or intimacy. But she didn't. She drew a line. And in that line, there was power, control over the emotional narrative, control over her own vulnerability, and a clear assertion that she would not be emotionally dictated to, even in the face of her father's illness. Thomas's eyes glistened slightly, a mixture of hurt and suppressed emotion. He understood immediately that this was not a fleeting statement. It was an intentional boundary. It was a declaration that even the gravity of illness and mortality could not compel her to compromise her emotional autonomy. The doctor described the atmosphere in the room as tense, brittle, and electrified. Every person present felt it. Even the monitors seemed to tick louder. Every small sound, the faint hum of machines, the rustle of a nurse's uniform, was amplified in the weight of that silence. Meghan's statement, though brief, carried multiple layers. On the surface, it was simple. She could not promise another visit. Beneath that, however, it was laden with implications. It suggested distance, guardedness, self-protection, and perhaps a reflection of the public scrutiny that had colored their relationship for years. It also hinted at an emotional calculus. She was aware of the stakes, aware of the history, and making a deliberate choice about her engagement. Staff noted Thomas's attempt to respond again. He coughed softly, adjusting the blankets, searching for words that might bridge the emotional gap. But Meghan remained poised, listening but not conceding, her gaze steady. The doctor observed that this poised composure was both a shield and a signal, an indication that she was navigating her emotions with precision, balancing empathy with self-preservation. And then came another subtle, yet significant moment, the glance. Meghan's eyes briefly flicked toward her companion, almost imperceptibly. The doctor interpreted this as a silent consultation, a micro-decision about pacing and emotional exposure. It was a reminder that every movement, every glance, every pause in this room carried layered meanings, invisible to the untrained observer but glaringly apparent to those attuned to human behavior. Have you ever noticed how a single sentence, delivered in the right tone, can reshape an entire relationship. That was the effect of Meghan's words. They were neither cruel nor cold, yet they carried the unmistakable weight of emotional finality. For Thomas, it was a revelation, a shock, and an invitation to confront decades of unresolved issues all at once. The doctor later noted that the physiological response in Thomas was striking. His heart rate spiked, then steadied. His breathing became uneven for a moment, then normalized. The subtle tremor in his hand persisted, a silent indicator of internal conflict and emotional processing. Every small response was a testament to the power of words, especially those carefully chosen and deliberately timed. And the room remained suspended in that tension, teetering between potential reconciliation and the stark reality of distance. The first statement had set the emotional tone, yet it was only the beginning. The doctor emphasized that the most revealing, most emotionally charged moments of this visit were still to come. And that's the cliffhanger. Meghan's declaration, "I can't promise I'll visit again," was just the first step in an emotional journey.